Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
So I finally started watching and quickly got all up to speed on the Gilded Age.
I still haven't watched it.
There's only 2 seasons right now, so it's pretty easy to blaze through it.
Yeah.
I binged it all very quickly in the course of like a week. It is as spectacular as everyone says, thus the binging. And it put me in mind of a topic that I've had on my list for a minute, and that is the Bradley Martin Ball. This ball happened in the years following what's been going on in the Gilded Age for anyone that's watching. And it probably, although who knows, falls too late on the timeline for the show to get into it in any upcoming seasons. I've also debated about doing one on Ward McAllister, but I just don't know if I want to. I mean, he's fabulously interesting, but a lot of people have covered him in a lot of ways. So that's really more of the holdup there than anything else. But the Bradley Martin Ball, which has not been on the show, and I don't know if it will make it there because it happens, I feel like, a decade after what's going on in the main plot right now, is sometimes referred to as the last big moment of the Gilded Age. And it was very ostentatious. This event sparked so much debate, and in some ways, ridicule about it, some people have said, helped usher in the crumbling of New York's Victorian-era society culture and it being considered really important. But before we get into the details of this historic ball, we're going to start by talking briefly about its hosts, Bradley and Cornelia Martin, and the social scene of New York at the end of the 19th century.
Bradley Martin was born December 18th, 1841 in Albany, New York. His parents were Anne Townsend Martin and Henry Hull Martin. Henry was a prominent banker, and both he and Anne were from old money. They were very active in Albany's wealthy social scene. Bradley attended Union University in Albany and served with the Union in the U.S. Civil War, was a first lieutenant in the National Guard's 93rd Regiment.
In 1869, Martin married Cornelia Sherman. His brother, Frederick Townsend Martin, described the two meeting in his book, Things I Remember, this way, quote, "My brother Bradley married Miss Cornelia Sherman on January 26, 1869. He had made her acquaintance at the wedding of Elliot Shepard, who was then acting as aide-de-camp to Governor Reuben Fenton. Miss Sherman was one of the bridesmaids, and my brother fell in love at first sight with the charming girl." Bradley became a very successful lawyer, and he amassed quite a nice fortune. And then when Cornelia's father died, he left her a great deal of money. That was actually something of a surprise. No one knew he had as much money as he did, but it made the Martins extremely rich.
In 1881, the Martins started living a multinational life. They leased the estate of Balmacan on the shores of Scotland's Loch Ness. This was a haven for wealthy guests who visited the Martins for the hunting season, and they enjoyed Balmacan's 28,000-acre deer forest. Bradley Martin's New York Times obituary said that the Martins routinely had as many as 70 guests staying with them in Scotland, as well as those guests' staff. This estate was described in the U.S. papers as, quote, an irregular pile of buildings.
Yeah, every time you see someone write about it, they're kind of like, this is interesting, in the way that they don't want to describe it as like a weird mess. The Martins' daughter, Cornelia Martin, married the Earl of Craven, and that connected the family to London society. While the groom brought a title to the marriage, Cornelia brought the money. Her father gave her $75,000 a year as an allowance once she was married. This also connected the Martin family to London's social scene, and that gave their stateside standing in society a boost.
To contextualize the Bradley Martin Ball of 1897, we first need to talk about patriarchs' balls. This was essentially a system set up by the infamous society arbiter Ward McAllister and many of the wealthiest old money families of New York. So think people like the Astors, the Van Rensselaers, Livingstons, and Schermerhorns. These balls had the stipulation that each of the patriarch families had to invite 5 men and 4 women to the ball as a means of establishing New York society. And then it's from this group that Ward McAllister developed his list of the 400. That was the people he deemed worthy to be considered New York high society. The Martins attended their first Patriarch's Ball in 1883, and soon they were on-ramped into the high society as the old names were increasingly commingled with new ones. The 400, as they were called, were accustomed to very opulent gatherings. And while the Bradley Martin Ball was in that tradition, it was over the top by any measure.
The idea for the Bradley Martin Ball was, according to the story, actually kind of benevolent. Once again, we have Frederick Townsend Martin's account of how the ball got its start. He wrote, quote, "Every year, my brother Bradley and his wife spent their winters in New York, when they entertained largely. One morning at breakfast, my brother remarked, 'I think it would be a good thing if we got up to something. There seems to be a great deal of depression in trade. Suppose we sent out invitations for a concert.' 'And pray, what good will that do?' asked my sister-in-law. 'The money will only benefit foreigners.' 'No, I've a far better idea. Let us give a costume ball at so short notice that our guests won't have time to get their dresses from Paris. That will give an impetus to trade that nothing else will.' Directly Mrs. Martin's plan became known, there was a regular storm of comment, which arose in the first instance from the remarks made by a clergyman who denounced the costume ball from the pulpit.
There's also speculation that Mrs. Martin wanted to throw the most lavish ball ever seen in the city, and in doing so, outdo her peers in society who'd hosted their own opulent events. This ball was to be huge, too large to be hosted at a home, so the Waldorf was selected for the location. As to the exact number of guests involved, that number fluctuates pretty wildly based on the source. While some say that Mrs. Martin would simply not have had more than 600, other accounts say she sent out 1,200 invitations. We'll get to a possible explainer on that discrepancy in a moment.
While the intent may have been economic stimulus, there was an early bit of sour grapes over how specifically money was being spent for this event. This came from the musicians of New York, who felt completely slighted when Mrs. Martin hired the Marine Band of Washington for her fete. In a quote in the New York Times, Alexander Bremer, president of the Music Mutual Protective Union, said, quote, "We were all congratulating ourselves over the coming ball of Mrs. Bradley Martin that is to be given on such a magnificent scale, and which will put money into circulation among people who need it very badly. We believe in the very wealthy spending their wealth and enjoying themselves, and thus giving hundreds and thousands of working people an opportunity to earn money and maintain their self-respect instead of being obliged to accept charity. Now, we have in our union in this city about 2,800 musicians who are struggling from day to day to make a living for themselves and their families. We calculated on getting at least $1,000 for our union musicians from this ball. But imagine our disappointment when we were told that Mrs. Bradley Martin had engaged or would engage the Marine Band to play at the ball." Bremer went on to praise the musicians of New York as being as good as any found anywhere, even in Europe.
We'll talk more about criticisms of the ball in just a bit. And coming up right after a quick sponsor break, we will dig into the press coverage of the Bradley Martin Ball and all the juicy details of the event's planning and how they were shared in the papers.
The days leading up to the Bradley Martin Ball were covered in detail in the press. The New York Times wrote on February 7th, quote, "For nearly 3 weeks, New York society has made the coming ball its one topic of discussion, with the result that the usual entertainments of the winter season have sunk into comparative insignificance. English, French, and German history of the period from 1500 to 1900, which has been selected by Mrs. Martin as that to which the costumes of her guests must conform, has been searched in quest of facts and information. Old wardrobes have been ransacked, and costumes, milliners, dressmakers, and wigmakers, and even jewelers have been besieged by a small army of people bidden to the ball, and who have labored assiduously to attire themselves as was ever Solomon in all his glory."
The arrangements of what the attendees could expect were shared in detail, so even people who weren't going to be in attendance knew all the specifics and, of course, had plenty of opinions about them. Even the schedule was included. The ball was to begin at 11 p.m., with guests arriving through the manager's door to the Waldorf. The write-up made it clear that this entry was one used for logistics, and the guests would not see any decor in the first 5 rooms they walked through. The finery was all reserved for the party proper. Some of this was because guests themselves were not expected to arrive party ready in the wintertime. Instead, the Martins had hired a team of hairdressers, milliners, costumers, etc. to help everybody put the finishing touches onto their attire. The accommodations for the guest transformations were spread across 15 rooms, so the stylists had plenty of space to prepare everyone. Those dressing rooms also offered spots where, once the party was underway, guests could take breaks.
Yeah, I think one of them was set up as like a smoking lounge for gentlemen and things like that. On February 9th, the New York Times ran another article, this one about all of the priceless items that would be on display in the costumery of the ball's attendees. It opened with, quote, "There is no estimating the value of the rare old jewels to be worn at the Bradley Martin Ball. All the jewelers who deal in antiques say they have been cleaned out of all they had on hand, and people still keep calling for old buckles, snuff boxes, lorgnettes, diamond or pearl-studded girdles, rings, and in fact, every conceivable decoration in gems."
The rest of the article walks through some of the finery that people would be wearing. It also notes that a lot of people would be taking their priceless family jewels and heirloom pieces out of storage, and that there was no way to estimate how much all of these were worth. Some had been passed down for hundreds of years from European aristocracy. There was a rumor that some of the guests were so worried about their family jewelry that they were having the real gemstones from them taken out to be replaced with imitations. A representative from Tiffany's assured the press that this was not the case, stating, quote, "It is ridiculous to suppose that the quality of people who have these rare and costly gems would ever think of attending such a historic function in sham ornaments. Don't you believe a word of it? So far as we are concerned, we never set bogus jewels at all, and we certainly have not been asked to substitute rhinestones by any of Mrs. Martin's intended guests. People who are accustomed to these costly things are not afraid to use and display them."
According to the Times, there would also be priceless lace everywhere at the ball. Again, much of it passed down through wealthy families. One expert on textiles that the paper consulted was quoted as saying that replicas of some of the laces would go for $50 a yard. Again, replicas. And then when it came to the originals, quote, "You couldn't buy them for $500 a yard." The papers published lists of who was attending and what they would be wearing. Jay Brownick was to be attired as George Washington. Mrs. John Jacob Astor was going to be Marie Antoinette. She was one of several. That was the most popular costume. And there were to be multiple Louis XIVs, XVs, and XVI. Bradley Martin was to be one of the many Louis XVs, although sometimes he's listed as having been dressed as Louis XIV. Though not mentioned in the press beforehand, Mrs. Martin dressed as Mary Stuart and wore a very old and very valuable necklace as part of that costume. Some costumes, such as one that was intended to be Pocahontas, would be considered completely inappropriate by today's standards.
The most comedic section of the article on what people would be wearing focused on the issues that the gentlemen guests would face. It elaborates, quote, "To begin with, the costumer's edict has gone forth that all gentlemen who intend to appear in a Louis XIV outfit must begin by turning a barber loose on their mustaches, with plenipotentiary powers to remove them to the last hair. Apparently, some men formed a pact that none of them would acquiesce to this requirement."
Listen, if you have ever thrown a costume party with specific rules, you know this exact discussion, because I have been there. Listen. But the bigger issue was apparently the shape of men's legs. The Times laid out this problem. Quote, "Trouble number 2 is of a rather more delicate nature, as it will unmask delusions about the anatomy of certain gentlemen's legs. As a rule, it is an easy matter in these days to disguise any defects of this kind, but it can't be done at all, so the costumers say, with those extremely delicate and dainty silk tights, which the modern cavaliers must wear. All sort of devices have been attempted, even down to the buckram-covered pads that Ward McAllister used to effect, but they will not work, and much lamentation is abroad in the social world thereat. Any manufactured legs will be palpable at sight, but the raw material would be more horrible still. Many of the Cavaliers have not yet finished losing sleep over this problem. Oh no, they'll find out I have skinny quads.
Are they only talking about the legs though? Because there's just other parts of the body that's going to be in the very thin fitting hose.
Yes, I think so, because the one person that shows up in thin fitting hoses got thrown out.
Yeah. Okay then. Okay.
I think they're worried that people will know their calves are not manly.
Okay. I could just imagine it being a euphemism. Yeah, anyway, the day of the ball, the Chicago Tribune published a breakdown of the estimated cost of the whole thing. Line items included things like the ballroom rental for the night at $1,000, a small ballroom for receiving at $500, a buffet supper at $6,000, a regular supper to be available from 12:30 to 5 a.m. at $12,000, and the cotillion favors at $20,000. The largest line item was costumes, which the paper estimated at $168,000. The total the Tribune came up with for everything was $236,625, but the Tribune said this was a conservative figure. The actual cost of the ball is often quoted as having been more like $400,000, which is already a whole lot of money. In very rough estimates, that would be more like $10 million in 2024.
Yeah, and to be clear, that costume line item was not for everyone's costumes. That was like the stuff that the Bradley Martins were providing for people to like help with all of their costumes. When the evening of February 10th came, the weather didn't really cooperate. There was a massive snowstorm, but the ball went on as scheduled. This made carriage traffic in New York absolutely awful. According to Robert Musagrosso, writing for New York History in 1994, and my apologies if I mispronounced that name, another thing that literally stopped traffic was people exiting their carriages as they passed by Gilbert's photo studio on the way because they wanted pictures of their attire. Gilbert's is said to have stayed open all night, and as a consequence, the upside is that today we have some very good photographs of the attendees.
Arriving at this ball was unlike anything the attendees had ever experienced. Frederick Martin described the scene this way, quote, "The best I can describe the Bradley Martin Ball is to say that it reproduced the splendor of Versailles in New York, and I doubt if even the Roi Soleil ever witnessed a more dazzling sight. The interior of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel was transformed into a replica of Versailles, and rare tapestries, beautiful flowers, and countless sights made an effective background for the wonderful gowns and their wearers. I do not think there has ever been a greater display of jewels before or since. In many cases, the diamond buttons worn by the men represented thousands of dollars, and the value of the historic gems worn by the ladies baffles description. The power of wealth with its refinement and vulgarity was everywhere. It gleamed from countless jewels, and it was proclaimed by the thousands of orchids and roses whose fragrance that night was like incense burnt on the altar of the golden calf."
The reception of guests alone took almost 2 hours before the official party activities began. There was dancing and then supper, and then at 3 a.m., the cotillion. The Martins did not leave until 6 a.m. Many guests had taken rooms at the Waldorf so that they wouldn't have to travel to or from the ball.
One slightly scandalous costume was worn by artist Athos Cushing. He dressed as a 15th century Italian falconer, and according to the New York Times, quote, was in fact thought to have gone rather too far in his impersonation. He wore tights and a short jacket, and he had a stuffed falcon attached to his arm. Apparently, although this was historically accurate, this outfit was skin tight and thus rather revealing, and he caused such a commotion that Mrs. Bradley Martin asked him to leave.
Yes, she apparently lost her breath for a moment before she collected herself and said that was inappropriate. Once this entire party was over, accounts went to press. It was described as a triumph, also as a circus, as something beautiful and exquisite, and as ridiculous. The New York Times noted that many guests seemed to leave as quickly as they could, calling for their carriages before the cotillion even began. It also stated that the 600 in attendance was a much lower number than hoped for, and this may be part of the confusion over how many invites were sent out. It's not clear if maybe there was a retrofit of how many they had invited to make it look like less people had declined than had actually done so. But it also describes this whole affair, this New York Times write-up, as, quote, the climax in this form of entertainment thus far reached in the metropolis.
Coming up, we'll talk about the various opinions that religious leaders and everyday people and even tax assessors had of this whole event. And we will get to it after we hear from the sponsors that keep the show going.
The Bradley Martin Ball quickly became a flashpoint in public perception of how rich people operated. Cornelia Martin's intentions may have been good, and the ball certainly did help bolster tradespeople in the costuming, catering, and related business sectors, but that was just a small slice of the population of New York. To most people, the whole thing just looked wasteful and decadent and self-indulgent. Given how many attendees had chosen to look to the court of 17th century France for costume inspiration, it became a sort of fitting echo of out-of-touch wealthy people thinking they were helping the lower classes by having fun, instead of engaging in more meaningful charitable works.
The press wasn't all bad, though. The Boston Daily Globe ran a commentary about the ball on the front page 2 weeks before the event, under the headline, On Volcano's Edge, where some think the Bradley Martin guests will dance. It ran information that had been collected regarding the actual impact the ball was having to working people in New York. One costume shop had reported that they had so many orders it had created work for 180 seamstresses. The shop owner is quoted as telling Bradley Martin of their staff, quote, they are happy because they need work and your ball has furnished it. Every woman probably represents a family and may be its chief breadwinner, so the good does not end with these 180 people, but in many cases benefits 2 and 3 times that number. The write-up also explains that many of the attendees purchased art reproductions so that costumers could copy the clothing in them, hinting that the art market also saw some movement because of the ball. The opening of this multi-page look at the economics of the ball also noted that in addition to expected beneficiaries of additional work like wig makers and boot makers, even errand girls were making a lot more money in the weeks leading up to the big night.
The Globe got quotes from all kinds of people on the matter. Francis Peabody Jr. was quoted as saying, quote, I believe in hospitality. The rich should be very hospitable, but ostentation without hospitality is essentially vulgar. Mr. Peabody also mentioned his 2 big problems with the ball, noting that such an extravagance would take away attention from the real issues of the poor, and also that there were likely people who might be inspired to live beyond their means as a result of normalizing such events. Mr. Edwin D. Mead stated to the Globe, quote, wicked, wasteful, and wanton luxury is one of the greatest sins and dangers in our American life today, and I repeat it with emphasis now when such an illustration of it is proposed.
One man said, quote, I wish this ball cost 10 times whatever it will cost. It will get the money into circulation. Why, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker get much of the money and they need it. If the Martins pay their bills, I don't feel I have any right to criticize. There were other people who felt like the ball was doing as intended, giving work to people who would need it and who would then spend that money throughout their communities.
One of the lengthier responses from Rabbi Charles Fleischer examined more deeply the ethical issues of the money that the Martins were spending. He spoke to the paper about every man having the right to himself, and that not being something other people should infringe upon. He then continued, quote, I am not blind to the fact that these expensive functions give employment to quite a little army of workers. If I thought that the question had only this temporary interest, perhaps I would not hesitate to say, eat, drink, and be merrier than usual. Dress and entertain more lavishly than ever, for every unusual extravagance puts more money into circulation and gives added opportunity of employment. Your indulgence in luxuries will enable many a wretch to earn the bare necessities. But my view of the question is a large one. Even in these times, we must not expect to revive business and set the wheels of industry in motion by artificial means. You might as reasonably expect to sail a boat when becalmed by the wind which results from your whistling for it. After being questioned for clarity, the rabbi responded, "If the fortune that will be spent and wasted at the ball was put into some permanent investment that would continue to give employment and to yield returns, the gain to the world's wealth and the benefit to labor would be incalculably larger."
Even before the ball happened, according to Bradley's brother Frederick, there was criticism from the city's religious leaders. He quoted one minister who included mention of the ball in his Sunday sermon. Quote, "You rich people put next to nothing in the collection plate, and yet you'll spend thousands of dollars on Mrs. Bradley Martin's ball."
Reverend William S. Rainsford urged invitees in his congregation to skip the ball, noting that social conditions were already both awful and a hot-button issue, and hinting that it would make them look really bad to attend. When he was questioned by a New York Times reporter about the sermon, he stated that what he said in his church was between him and his parishioners. But he also noted to the reporter that while spending for the ball, quote, might benefit a large number of well-to-do people and through them the poorer people, he thought such benefit was overbalanced by the discord which would or might be created.
On March 5th, the New York Times ran a brief piece quoting Dr. Samuel Johnson's opinion of the ball, which read, quote, "A man cannot make a bad use of his money so far as regards society. If he does not hoard it, or if he rather spends it or lends it out, society has the benefit. It is in general better to spend money than to give it away. A man who spends his money is sure he is doing good with it. He is not sure when he gives it away. A man who spends $10,000 a year will do more good than a man who spends $2,000 and gives away $8."
Public opinion about the Martins and their massive ball had become so vitriolic in the days leading up to it that there was concern there might be a riot outside of it or even a violent attack on the attendees. Invitee Theodore Roosevelt, who was on the board of police commissioners in New York at the time, skipped the ball while his wife attended because he wanted to be outside with his police force ready to lead them in case something happened. I read one theory that he didn't really want to go to the ball and this was a good excuse, but we don't know. There were 200 police officers covering the area as well as a number of plainclothes policemen. No problems ever really arose other than people on the street being kind of irritated by all the commotion.
It hadn't helped that a huge chunk of 33rd Street had been closed to pedestrians the night of the ball so that the carriages of the wealthy attendees could more easily make their way. This was presumably also a security measure, given the large number of valuables that were walking in and out of the event. This sent a message that rich people were more important to the city than average citizens. Roosevelt, because of his role with the police, dismissed these complaints as nonsense and said in a statement to the press that anyone with business on the street had been able to pass and that the police were trying to avoid accidents from onlookers obstructing traffic on the clogged street more than anything else. He insisted they would have done the same thing for any event, regardless of the grandeur.
As for Frederick Martin's account, though he did mention the combination of refinement and vulgarity in his description, he also said of the ball, quote, "I cannot conceive why this entertainment should have been condemned. We Americans are so accustomed to display that I should have thought the ball would not have been regarded as anything very unusual. Everyone said it was the most brilliant function of the kind ever seen in America, and it certainly was the most talked about."
Not just talked about, but also satirized. On March 26th, just 45 days after the ball, a new burlesque musical opened at the Olympia Music Hall titled Mrs. Radley Barton's Ball in Greater New York. This work, created by Oscar Hammerstein, got mixed reviews. While one syndicated review said, quote, "All the manifold resources of the Olympia were concentrated in the music hall with a superb production. In the opinion of competent critics, the production equals in splendor anything of the kind ever seen in New York." Other critics were far less kind, with one commentator noting, quote, "On the whole, it was without a redeeming feature." And Hammerstein got embroiled in a back and forth with the press about it. Alas, the libretto to this has not survived, and there seems to be no real information about the contents of the play itself.
Yeah, even historians of Hammerstein are like, we don't know. We don't know what was in it.
Wouldn't it be fun, though?
Oh, the dream. That's my dream for Unearthed one day. In the wake of this ball, the Martins found that they faced a significant increase in their taxes. Their property in New York was reevaluated and determined to be worth double what it had previously been assessed at. This was not a case where all of the high-end homes of New York simultaneously got reassessed and went up in value. It was the Martins alone, and they felt this was retribution for the ball. This led to a lengthy dispute with New York authorities and large tax sums being paid by the Martins. And having that issue, after also having endured constant criticism from the press, really soured Bradley and Cornelia Martin on New York society life. In the spring of 1899, Martin sold his home in New York with the address 20 and 22 West 20th Street, that is in the Flatiron District, and he hosted a much smaller farewell dinner for their closest friends, 86 of them, before leaving the U.S. for good. They purchased a home at 4 Chesterfield's Gardens in London, and from that point on, Bradley and Cornelia lived exclusively in the British Isles. They continued to spend summers at their Scotland estate.
Bradley Martin died in London on February 5th, 1913, after a short case of pneumonia, which developed at the tail end of a bout of the flu. Even then, 16 years after the ball, his obituaries ran with subtitles like, "Gave great ball in 1897. When he died, he left his entire estate, which was valued at between $10 and $15 million, to his wife, Cornelia. Much to the chagrin of American tax assessors, because he had established legal residency in England, that massive accumulation of assets, which consisted of railroad bonds, stock, and cash, was not taxable in New York, according to newspaper records of the time. His wife, Cornelia, died 7 years later.
Yeah, and all of that bad press, some people have said, kind of harkened the end of New York society. I could talk about this ball forever because it fascinates me. It's such a weird and sort of wonderful, but also what kind of situation. uh, in the meantime,
Listener mail?
I have delightful listener mail
Oh,
from
good.
our listener, Jen, who writes, "Hi, guys. Longtime listener here, and whilst I've threatened to write in before, the episode on Margaret E. Knight tipped me over the edge. You speak about industrial mill accidents, and I specialize in Lancashire dialect weaving songs and ballads from Manchester and Lancashire, UK from the 19th century. Shuttles were certainly dangerous, and this is reflected in the songs. In Poverty Knock, there's a verse about a shuttle flying out and giving a weaver a clout, and Sam Fitton of Oldham, caricaturist and weaver, drew an image of a weaver being hit in the head with a shuttle and a caption of, 'Ee how nice, oh how nice,' in the Cotton Factory Times. I have dedicated my life to making the songs relevant to a modern population to keep the flame of local history lit, and most recently have written a manuscript using the songs to understand the contemporary garment industry in Bangladesh today. My work is here. You can go to jenniferballads.com if you want to check that out. Jennifer also writes, "Keep up the good work. I love driving the van and listening to you both. I don't have a pet, but here's a picture of my boyfriend and Puffin. She also answers to Tiffin, and she has the sweetest heart. Puffin looks like a husky or Malamute and is gorgeous and looks like a big baby, which I love. All the best." And she writes, "All my best, Jen." Thank you so much. I love knowing that there's someone out there working to make sure this stuff, which we talk about as historical past events, stays relevant to people and is easy to draw the line from things that happen in history to things that are happening today, because that's really kind of our whole jam. And it's cool, and I love it. I haven't gotten to go check out your work yet, Jen, but I will after this.
I only clicked on the URL, but I do already know the song Poverty Knock, because I used to hang out with a lot of Renaissance Festival performers and folk singers. And I think unless that's your jam, unless that's like the circle that you move in, I feel like the place that people might have encountered that song is on a Chumbawamba album, which, if the only Chumbawamba song you know is Tub Thumpin', that one, there's just a whole catalog of songs about like anarchy and labor and all of that, including a whole album called English Rebel Songs that includes a version of Poverty Knock on there. I actually like that song quite a lot, so I was very glad to get an email about it.
Nice. If you would like to write us an email, you can do so at historypodcast@iheartradio.com. You can also find us on social media as Missed in History. And if you have yet to subscribe, you can do that right now. It's super easy on the iHeartRadio app or anywhere you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.